The turning point. The day had started as any other. I awoke, went through the routine of morning prayers, and prepared myself for a day of service. Being a Catholic priest, my life was dedicated to the Church, to God, and to my congregation. It was a life of ritual, of structure, and of order. It wasn't perfect, but it was the life I knew. One filled with faith, devotion, and the sense that I had it all figured out. As a priest, I had spent years studying the scriptures, understanding the doctrine, and becoming proficient in the rituals of the Church. I could recite prayers in my sleep, I could deliver a sermon with ease, and I could lead the Mass without hesitation. There was comfort in knowing the rules, the teachings, the guidelines of faith. And that's where I thought the connection with God lay, in the practice, in the tradition, in the community. I thought I knew God. I thought I understood the essence of belief and faith. But there came a moment when all of that would change, when everything I thought I understood about faith would be called into question. It wasn't dramatic at first. There was no warning, no sign that my life was about to shift in ways I could never have imagined. It was just another day. I was in the church preparing for an afternoon meeting with a parishioner. Everything was routine. Until it wasn't. I felt it coming, though I didn't recognize it at first. A sharp pain in my chest. My vision blurred. My heart began to race. My legs gave way beneath me. And before I could even process what was happening, everything went dark. I fell to the floor, unconscious, and in those moments, I was gone. When I came to, I was no longer in the familiar, comforting surroundings of my church. I was somewhere else, somewhere dark, cold, and distant. It didn't feel like a place at all. It felt more like a state of being. The air was thick, suffocating almost, as if the weight of existence itself had become unbearable. My heart raced again, not from panic, but from something else, something I can't quite explain. It was a fear, something primal, rising within me. I had never believed in the concept of hell as it was often preached, fires and brimstone, demons, eternal torment. No, I had always thought of hell as more metaphorical, more abstract. But here, in this dark, suffocating place, I could feel the weight of separation from God. It was a coldness I had never experienced in all my years of ministry, and it was terrifying. I tried to reach out for something, anything, to give me comfort, but my hands were met only by emptiness. It was as though I was alone in the universe, lost in some kind of spiritual void. And then I saw him. He appeared before me, not in the way I had always imagined, not the way the statues in the church depicted him. This was no ordinary image of Christ. This was no painting, no carved figure. This was real. This was life. He stood before me, radiant, not in the sense of a bright light, but in the way the light emanated from him. It wasn't the blinding light of the sun. It was something different, something alive. The very air around him seemed to glow with a peace and love I could not comprehend. I couldn't help but be drawn to him, even in the overwhelming darkness surrounding us. His eyes locked with mine, and in that moment, I felt as if he could see every part of me. Every thought, every sin, every prayer I had said. And yet there was no judgment. There was only compassion, a depth of understanding I could never have fathomed. I had spent my life teaching about the love of God, but here, standing before me, was the very embodiment of that love. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked at me with eyes full of knowing, full of tenderness, as if he were searching deep within my soul. There was a sadness in his gaze, a sadness I could not explain. And then, in an instant, I heard his voice, not in words as we speak them, but in a way that transcended sound. It was not a voice that filled the air, but a thought that filled my mind. It was immediate, powerful, and yet gentle. The thought, the word, the message was clear. Do you truly know me, or do you only know about me? And in that instant, everything I had built my life around crumbled. The foundations of my faith, the doctrines, the rituals, the teachings, the traditions, collapsed like a house of cards. I knew it in my bones. I had been so focused on the structure of religion, on doing all the right things, on following all the rules, that I had missed the most important part: the relationship, the connection, the heart of it all. I had spent my entire life knowing about Jesus, the stories, the scriptures, the rituals. I could recite them all, I could teach them all, but I had never truly known him. Not in the way he was meant to be known, not in the way I was meant to know him. My faith had become a set of instructions, a checklist of actions, and I had turned it into something I could control. I had forgotten the truth. Faith isn't about control. It's about surrender. It's about love. And that's when it hit me, the full weight of it. This wasn't just a near-death experience. This was a revelation. Jesus was not a distant figure to be studied and admired from afar. He was alive. He was present. And he was calling me, calling all of us, to a relationship that went beyond rituals, beyond beliefs, beyond traditions. He was calling us to truly know him, to open our hearts to him, and to invite him in. But what came next would change everything. The divine revelation. As the words, "Do you truly know me, or do you only know about me?" echoed in my mind, I felt as though the very foundation of my being was shaking. There was a moment, brief but profound, when everything I had ever understood about faith and religion seemed irrelevant. All my years of study, all the sermons I had delivered, all the prayers I had recited, seemed to pale in comparison to the realization that hit me like a tidal wave. I had known about Jesus, but I had never truly known him. It's hard to explain. But in that moment, the distinction between knowledge and relationship became crystal clear. I had always believed that my relationship with God was built on my understanding of Scripture, on my observance of tradition, and on my dedication to religious practice. But now, standing before me in the most unexpected of places, was the living Christ, radiating light, love, and peace, and he was challenging everything I thought I knew. He wasn't concerned with my credentials as a priest, nor my ability to perform rituals. He was inviting me to something much deeper, something that transcended all of that. As I stood there, awestruck by his presence, he began to show me glimpses of something beyond the walls of the church, beyond the limits of human understanding. It wasn't just words or ideas he shared. It was a vision, a revelation, a deep spiritual understanding that left me forever changed. Jesus spoke again, but this time, his words were not only directed at me. They felt universal, as though he was speaking to all of humanity. Heaven and hell, he said, are not simply places you go to after death. They are states of being. They are choices you make every day, in every thought, in every action. I don't know how to describe it, but in that moment, I felt as if I were seeing the world in a way I had never seen it before. Heaven wasn't just some paradise waiting for the righteous after death. No, heaven was here, right now. It was a state of being, a condition of the heart, a place of complete unity with God. It was peace. It was joy. It was love. Heaven was not confined to a distant realm, but it was present in every moment when we chose to walk in love and in relationship with God. On the other hand, hell was not a fiery pit of eternal punishment, as I had once imagined. No, hell was the absence of God, the complete separation from his love. It wasn't about punishment. It was about the void that exists when we choose to turn away from God, when we choose darkness over light. Hell was the isolation of the soul, the eternal sorrow of being cut off from the very source of love and life. And as he spoke these words, I began to understand them in a way I had never done before. The world, I saw, was not merely a place of good and evil in a superficial sense. The battle between light and darkness was not only happening on a cosmic level, it was happening within each of us. Every choice, every action, every thought either brought us closer to heaven or farther away from it. Jesus didn't stop there. As if he could see the questions forming in my mind, he continued, "The future is uncertain. The world is lost, drifting further into darkness. But there is hope. There is always hope for those who turn to God with genuine hearts. I could feel the weight of his words, the urgency behind them. The world, as I had always known it, was changing. There was an undeniable sense of spiritual unrest, a shift in the very fabric of society. The faith that I had once believed was so strong seemed to be fading. People had become too caught up in the distractions of the world, too focused on material things, on power, on wealth, on status. The connection with God, the genuine, personal relationship that we were all created for, had been lost in the noise of modern life. And yet he told me that all was not lost. Faith, he said, cannot be blind. It must be sincere. It must be real. It must be about relationship, not religion, not doctrine, not tradition. It must be about love. And love cannot be earned. It can only be received with open hands, with an open heart. It was in that moment that I realized the truth. I had spent my life following the rules, reciting prayers, teaching others about God, but I had neglected the most essential aspect of faith, the relationship with God. I had been so focused on the outward expressions of religion, the rituals, the liturgies, the doctrines, that I had missed the essence of what it meant to follow Christ. This wasn't about rituals or traditions. This wasn't about performing religious acts to earn favor with God. This was about the love that God freely offered to all of us. It was about accepting that love, receiving it with gratitude, and living it out in our daily lives. It wasn't about memorizing scripture or following a set of rules. It was about truly knowing Jesus, walking with him, talking with him, being in communion with him every moment of every day. He continued, I have come to show you the way, not through rituals or rules, but through relationship, through love. My grace cannot be earned. It must be accepted. And the only way to receive it is to open your heart to me. I was overwhelmed by the sheer beauty of it all. For so many years, I had thought that my faith was about my ability to perform, to adhere to certain expectations, to follow certain doctrines. But now, in the presence of Christ, I understood that faith was about surrender. It was about opening myself to him and allowing him to fill my heart with his love. And then, as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone. The light dimmed, the peace receded, and I was left standing alone in the darkness. But I was not the same person. I had been forever changed. It wasn't just a spiritual awakening. It was a rebirth. My understanding of faith, my understanding of God, had been completely transformed. I could feel it deep within me. A burning desire to share this truth with others, to help them see what I had seen, to show them that faith is not about religion. It's about relationship. It's not about performing religious duties to earn God's favor. It's about accepting his love, letting him into our hearts, and allowing that love to transform us from the inside out. I woke up in a hospital bed, surrounded by doctors and nurses. They were confused, perplexed by my sudden recovery after what they had believed to be a fatal heart attack. But I knew what had happened. I knew what I had seen. And in that moment, I made a vow to never be the same again. The return and the awakening. The sterile white walls of the hospital room did little to comfort me as I awoke. The quiet beeping of machines and the soft rustling of nurses moving around me felt almost foreign. My body was weak, drained, as if I had just returned from a long and harrowing journey. I couldn't yet process the enormity of what had just happened. But there was something else, something undeniable, burning within me. Something that had changed in me, something that I could not ignore, could not forget. As I looked around at the medical staff, their eyes wide with confusion and disbelief, I tried to make sense of what I had just experienced. They had no idea that while they were desperately trying to resuscitate my lifeless body, my spirit had journeyed to a place beyond comprehension, a place where I met the living Christ. I had been to the edge of eternity, felt the terrifying weight of separation from God, and then encountered the light, the love, and the grace that could only come from him. It was almost too much to bear, and yet I knew in my soul that I was not the same person. My body had been revived, yes, but my spirit had been awakened. I felt different, like something had been stripped away, and in its place was a renewed understanding, a renewed calling. When the doctors and nurses spoke to me, I nodded in response, though my mind was a million miles away. I could barely focus on their questions as they bombarded me with medical jargon. What had happened? What was the cause of the heart failure? Did I have any recollection of the event? But the only question that truly mattered to me was the one I'd heard from Jesus, echoing in my mind. Do you truly know me, or do you only know about me? As the days passed in the hospital, I found it hard to explain what I had experienced. The vividness of it all, the light, the peace, the love, it was impossible to put into words. I tried to share what had happened with a few close friends, fellow priests who had visited me during my recovery. But the reactions were mixed. Some were skeptical, dismissing my experience as a dream or a hallucination brought on by the trauma of my condition. Others were curious but unsure of what to make of it. And then there were those who looked at me as if I had lost my mind entirely. It didn't matter. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. I knew that something had changed in me, something far beyond the physical world. And I couldn't shake the powerful feeling that my time in this life had not been extended just for my own sake, but for something much greater. I had been given a mission, a new purpose. But as the days turned into weeks, I began to realize that the world around me was not prepared for the message I now carried. The church, the people I had spent my life serving, were not ready for the radical truth I had encountered. Faith, I had come to understand, was not about rituals and rules. It was not about traditions and dogma. Faith was about a living, breathing relationship with the Savior. Faith was about love. When I finally left the hospital, I was physically weak, but spiritually I felt stronger than I ever had. I knew that I had to share the message that had been revealed to me, this message of a personal, intimate connection with Jesus. I could no longer teach from the pulpit as I once had. I could no longer preach the same doctrines and rituals that I had for so many years. Something deep within me told me that I had to go beyond the surface of religion. I had to go to the heart of it all, the relationship with Christ that was at the core of true faith. I started with small conversations, one-on-one discussions with parishioners, with friends, with family. I shared the story of my experience. Some listened intently, their hearts open to what I was saying. Others seemed uncomfortable, dismissing it as some sort of emotional reaction to my near-death experience. But I pressed on. I knew that this was my calling now. There were moments when I felt overwhelmed by the weight of what I was doing, as if the task ahead of me was too great, too daunting. I had spent years building my identity around my role as a priest, my identity in the traditions and rituals of the church. To step away from that was not easy. But with each conversation, each sermon, I could feel the transformation within me taking hold. I could feel my spirit coming alive in ways I had never experienced before. In the quiet moments, when I sat alone and reflected on my journey, I felt the presence of Christ again. He wasn't just a figure in a book or a statue in a church anymore. He was real, he was present, and he was speaking to me, guiding me. It was as if he had reached into the depths of my soul and planted a seed, one that I had to nourish, one that had to grow, no matter the cost. And so I began to preach not about doctrines or rituals, but about a personal relationship with Jesus. I spoke of his love, of his grace, and of the transformative power of knowing him. I spoke of how we are not meant to simply follow rules and traditions, but to seek him out with all our hearts. I shared the message that faith is not about blind obedience, but about an open heart, ready to receive God's love. But it wasn't easy. As I began to preach this new message, I faced resistance. Some of my fellow clergy were uncomfortable with the changes I was making. They questioned my motives and even suggested that I was straying from the true path of the church. I was told I was too radical, too unorthodox. But deep down, I knew I had to continue. I knew I had been given a vision, a revelation that was too important to ignore. I had seen what it meant to truly know Christ, and I could not remain silent. In those moments of doubt, I often thought back to the words of Jesus. My grace cannot be earned. It must be accepted. And the only way to receive it is to open your heart to me. Those words kept me grounded, kept me focused. I wasn't doing this for my own recognition or approval. I was doing this because I believed that the message of Christ needed to be shared with the world. A message of love, grace, and relationship, not religion. As I continued on this new path, I began to encounter more people who were open to this message. They too were hungry for something more, something deeper. They wanted a connection with God, but they had been disillusioned by the rituals and traditions that had become a barrier to that relationship. And slowly, I began to see the fruit of my labor. People were coming to understand what it meant to truly know Christ, not just know about Him, but to walk with Him, to talk with Him, to let Him into their lives in a way that was personal and real. But even as I witnessed this transformation in others, I knew that the journey was far from over. The world was still dark, and the challenges were immense. People were lost in a world of distractions, seeking fulfillment in everything but God. But I believed with all my heart that the answer lay in the message I was now called to share. There was hope. There was always hope for those who sought Christ with an open heart, for those who were willing to surrender their lives to His love. And so I continued my mission, sharing the message of a living, breathing relationship with Jesus. I spoke to anyone who would listen, preaching not about religion, but about love. About the love of God that transcended all boundaries, all traditions, and all expectations. It was a love that could heal, that could transform, that could change the world. And as I spoke, I could feel His presence with me, guiding me, strengthening me, and reminding me of the truth that had been revealed to me, the truth that had changed my life forever. And I knew, with every fiber of my being, that I was exactly where I was meant to be. A new beginning in faith. I had spent years in service to the church, carrying the weight of tradition and the responsibility of faith, but nothing had prepared me for the overwhelming shift that had taken place within me. The man I had been before, devout, obedient, and unwavering in my religious practices, was no longer the man who now walked this earth. The priest who once stood confidently behind the altar, preaching the doctrines of the church with certainty, was now questioning everything he had once held to be true. But I wasn't questioning my faith. I was questioning the way we had been taught to practice it. It wasn't that the traditions were wrong. No, I had deep respect for the heritage and history of the church. But the relationship with Jesus that I had been so passionate about sharing was being obscured by rituals and rules. The love of God had become buried beneath a mountain of religious expectations and obligations. I had spent my life teaching others how to do faith, but now I understood. Faith was not about doing. It was about being in relationship with the Creator of the universe, not through the lens of ritual, but through the raw, authentic connection with Jesus. And so I set out on a new mission, one that would change the course of my ministry, and in many ways, my entire life. I no longer saw my role as a priest in the same light. I was not a gatekeeper of tradition or doctrine. I was a messenger of love, a bearer of the good news that faith was not about following rules. It was about knowing Jesus and allowing His love to transform every part of who we are. I began to realize that the church had become a place where people went to check off their spiritual boxes, attend Mass, say prayers, follow the commandments, and hope for salvation. But salvation wasn't something to be hoped for. It was something to be experienced, something to be lived, right here, right now. In those early days after my recovery, I spent countless hours in prayer, seeking clarity on how to share this new understanding of faith with the world. The days spent in the hospital bed had been a turning point, but the path forward was unclear. I was overwhelmed by the magnitude of the mission that lay before me. How could I convey such a profound truth to people who were so entrenched in their religious practices? How could I tell them that all the rituals, all the rules, all the teachings were secondary to the one thing that truly mattered? A relationship with Jesus. I struggled to put my thoughts into words, but I knew deep in my heart that this was not something I could keep to myself. The truth that had been revealed to me was too beautiful, too important, to remain hidden. I needed to speak, to share, to reach those who were hungry for more than just the formality of religion. I needed to show them that faith was about intimacy with God, not distant rituals or impersonal teachings. As I began to speak more openly about my experience, I was met with resistance. Some parishioners were puzzled by my shift in perspective. Others were uncomfortable with the idea of a faith that wasn't centered around the doctrines they had always known. There were even those who accused me of straying too far from the church, of abandoning the very essence of Catholicism that had guided my life for so long. But I was undeterred. I had seen the truth. I had felt the warmth of God's love in a way I could never have imagined before, and I could not, in good conscience, go back to the old way of doing things. I began to change the focus of my sermons. Gone were the days of simply reciting scripture and explaining church dogma. Now, I spoke of the personal connection that Jesus desired to have with each and every one of us. I told stories not just of religious figures or ancient prophecies, but of people today, people who were seeking the same love and grace I had found in my own life. I shared my own experience, my own awakening to the truth that faith is not a set of rules to be followed, but a relationship to be nurtured. Some people embraced this new message. They felt the sincerity in my words and understood that I wasn't preaching some new doctrine, but rather an ancient truth that had been overshadowed by centuries of tradition. I saw their eyes light up, their hearts open, as they began to realize that God's love wasn't something to be earned through good deeds or religious observance. It was a gift to be received, a gift that had already been given, waiting for us to open our hearts and accept it. But not everyone understood. The resistance I faced was often not overt, but subtle. I noticed the whispers in the hallways, the disapproving glances from some of my colleagues. They didn't outright condemn me, but their skepticism was palpable. The church was a place where traditions had been upheld for centuries, where the rituals were sacred and non-negotiable. To suggest that faith was about relationship, not ritual, was to challenge the very fabric of the institution. Yet, as I stood before my congregation each week, I felt the deep need to continue sharing this message. I knew it was right, not because it was easy, but because it was the truth. Jesus had not come to create a religion or a system of rules. He had come to restore our relationship with God, to bring us back to the Father through love. And I knew that this was the truth that the world so desperately needed to hear. In my own life, I began to feel the weight of this transformation. The once clear line between my role as a priest and my personal relationship with God had become blurred. The walls I had built around my faith had come crashing down, and what had been left in its place was a living, breathing connection with Jesus that permeated every area of my life. No longer was I simply the priest who performed rituals. I was a servant of God, walking with Him, talking with Him, living in His love every moment of every day. I could feel it in the way I looked at the world, the darkness that had seemed to envelop society, the apathy and disconnection from God, had started to seem less overwhelming. I knew that I wasn't meant to fight this battle alone. I had been called to awaken the hearts of others, to help them see that they, too, could experience this deep, life-changing relationship with Christ. The world didn't need more religion. The world needed more love, more grace, more authentic connection with the Creator. And so, I pressed on. I continued to preach this radical message, one that was grounded not in doctrine but in love. I encouraged my congregation to take a step beyond religion, to move past the rituals and into the heart of faith. I called them to open their hearts to Jesus, to seek Him in the quiet moments, in the chaos of their lives, in the people they met. I invited them to embrace a love that was not based on performance, but on grace, a love that couldn't be earned, but only received. And in return, I began to see the transformation. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, I saw people begin to shift. Their eyes softened as they understood what it meant to truly know Jesus, not just as a figure in a book, but as a living, breathing presence in their lives. I watched as families healed, as relationships were restored, as people rediscovered the joy of faith, not as a burden, but as a gift. I saw lives being changed, hearts being opened, and I knew that I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The path ahead was not easy, and I knew there would be obstacles, but I also knew that this was not just my mission. It was a mission for everyone who believed. Jesus wasn't just calling priests and religious leaders to share this message. He was calling everyone. Everyone who had ever been lost in the rituals, who had ever felt disconnected from God, who had ever longed for something more. He was calling them to step out of religion and into relationship, to discover the love that could heal them, transform them, and set them free. The world was still full of darkness, and the challenges ahead were great. But I had seen the light. I had felt it. And I knew that no matter how dark the world seemed, the light of Christ would always be there, shining in the hearts of those who truly sought Him. The struggle for authentic faith. As my ministry shifted and my message became more radical, I encountered new challenges that forced me to question everything I had built my life upon. There were those who felt threatened by the changes I was advocating for. My colleagues in the clergy, who had spent their entire lives adhering to the structured ways of the church, viewed my newfound perspective with suspicion. They questioned my intentions, accused me of deviating from the path, and warned me of the dangers of abandoning tradition. At first, their words stung. I had spent years training to become a priest, to follow in the footsteps of those who had come before me. I had been taught to revere the doctrines and dogmas of the church, to teach the traditions as though they were sacrosanct. And now, suddenly, I was calling all of that into question. I was advocating for a faith that was not built on rituals or rules, but on a deep personal relationship with Jesus Christ. The very foundation of my life was being torn apart, and with it, my place within the church. But despite the resistance, there was a fire burning inside me that I could not extinguish. I had seen the truth, had felt it in the very depths of my soul, and I could no longer keep it to myself. I had been given a gift, a profound revelation of God's love, and I knew that I had a responsibility to share it. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the countless people who were living lives of emptiness, going through the motions of religion without ever truly experiencing the love of Christ. I began to understand that this struggle was not just mine. It was the struggle of everyone who had ever felt disconnected from the heart of God. It was the struggle of every believer who had been taught to focus on the external practices of religion while neglecting the internal transformative power of a real relationship with Christ. This was the battle between a faith based on external obligations and a faith based on the internal, intimate connection with God. And it was a battle that was not just spiritual, it was cultural, institutional, and deeply personal. The tension between religion and relationship became more pronounced as I continued to preach my message. I spoke about love, the unconditional, overwhelming love of God that was not earned through deeds or rituals, but was freely given to all who sought it. I spoke about grace, the grace that was not a reward for good behavior, but a gift, available to all, no matter their past, no matter their flaws. And I spoke about the power of knowing Jesus, not as a distant figure in a book, but as a living, breathing presence in our lives. But as I shared this message, I saw the divisions grow. The church, as I had known it, was built on centuries of tradition, and many of those traditions were deeply embedded in the hearts of its followers. The doctrines, the dogmas, the rituals, they had become sacred in the eyes of the people. And now, here I was, standing in front of them, challenging everything they had ever known. To some, I was a heretic, a radical, someone who had abandoned the true path of faith. To others, I was a beacon of hope, a light in the darkness, calling them to something deeper, something more meaningful. The internal struggle I faced was intense. I knew the road ahead would be difficult. I knew that change would not come easily, especially in an institution as ancient and entrenched as the church. But I could not ignore the calling I had received. I had been shown a new way, a way that was grounded not in tradition or rule, but in love and relationship, and that was the way I was going to follow, no matter the cost. As I reflected on this, I realized that the resistance I was facing wasn't just about doctrine. It was about fear. Fear of change, fear of letting go of the old ways, fear of embracing a faith that didn't fit neatly into the box of tradition. People were afraid of what it meant to have a personal, direct relationship with God. They were afraid of the freedom that came with it. They were afraid of what might happen if they no longer relied on the structures of the church to define their faith. And in their fear, they clung to what was familiar, even if it was no longer life-giving. But I also realized that fear was not the only force at work. There was hope in the hearts of those who were listening, who were hearing the message I was sharing. There were those who were tired of religion as usual, tired of the hollow practices that offered no real connection to the divine. They were hungry for something more, for a faith that wasn't just about following rules, but about truly knowing Jesus. And as I preached, I saw their hearts open. I saw them embrace the message of love, grace, and personal relationship. I saw lives being transformed, not through religious rituals, but through the transformative power of God's love. It was in these moments that I felt my resolve strengthen. I knew that I was not alone in this journey. I had seen the power of God's love, and I knew that it was more than enough to overcome the darkness, to heal the brokenness, and to restore what had been lost. And as I continued to share my message, I saw the seeds of change being planted. They weren't always visible, but I knew they were there, taking root in the hearts of those who were willing to hear. Yet, as much as I wanted to focus on the positive, the struggle remained. The resistance from the church was not going away. I found myself increasingly at odds with the institution I had once devoted my life to. There were meetings with higher-ups, discussions about my sermons, and the direction I was taking. Some of my fellow priests expressed concern for my well-being, warning me that I was straying too far from the truth. Some even suggested that I was becoming a danger to the faith. The pressure was immense, and there were times when I doubted myself. I questioned whether I was doing the right thing, whether I was truly hearing God's voice, or if I was simply deceiving myself. But then I would remember the words of Jesus, the words that had changed everything for me. Do you truly know me, or do you only know about me? And I would remember the love, the light, the grace I had felt in His presence. I would remember the truth that had been revealed to me in that moment of profound clarity. And I would remember that no matter the cost, I could not go back to the old ways. The truth was too important. The relationship with Christ was too vital. In those moments of doubt, I sought solace in the quiet of prayer. I would sit alone, speaking to God, asking for guidance, asking for the strength to keep going. And every time, without fail, I would feel His presence, His peace, and His love surround me. It was a reminder that I was not alone in this struggle. The Holy Spirit was with me, guiding me, and I was not fighting this battle for myself. I was fighting for the hearts of those who were hungry for a deeper, more intimate faith. As the days passed, I began to see more and more people begin to embrace this message. They were tired of religion, tired of the rules and regulations that had become the focus of their faith. They were yearning for something more, a connection with God that was real, personal, and transformative. And as they opened their hearts to Jesus, I saw their lives change. I saw broken marriages healed, struggling families restored, and individuals freed from the chains of guilt and shame. I saw the power of God's love at work in the world, and I knew that it was worth every struggle, every sacrifice. But even as I saw the fruits of my labor, I knew that the journey was far from over. There were still many who were resistant to this new way of faith. The battle between religion and relationship, between tradition and transformation, was far from finished. But I also knew that as long as I had breath in my lungs, I would continue to fight for the truth that had been revealed to me. The love of God was too beautiful, too powerful, to remain hidden, and I would do everything in my power to share that love with the world. The fulfillment of the mission. As I continued my journey, I came to realize that the process of transformation was not just a momentary event, but an ongoing evolution, a lifelong commitment to living in relationship with Christ. The message that had once been a revelation, something new and revolutionary to me, began to take on deeper layers of meaning as I lived it out. Each day, I discovered more about the depth of God's love and the personal connection He desired with every soul. It wasn't easy. The resistance I faced, both from within the church and from society at large, never fully disappeared. The church as an institution was grounded in centuries of tradition, and many people had difficulty accepting the notion that faith could be a personal journey rather than a series of structured rituals. Some clung desperately to the idea that salvation was a transaction, something to be earned by following rules, reciting prayers, and attending Mass. They couldn't fathom that grace, God's unmerited favor, was already freely given to everyone, irrespective of their ability to perform religious duties. The skepticism I encountered was frustrating at times. I had spent my life as a priest, devoted to the church, and yet now, as I stood before people, sharing what had been revealed to me, I often felt the weight of judgment. I wasn't following the well-trodden path. I wasn't adhering to the safe, predictable way of faith that had been passed down through generations. I was breaking new ground, uncharting the territory that most had taken for granted. But there were moments when the resistance began to fade. Slowly, and sometimes imperceptibly, I began to see the fruits of my labor. I saw people begin to understand that it wasn't enough just to follow the rules or go through the motions. It wasn't enough to merely know about Jesus. They needed to know Him personally, intimately. They needed to feel His presence, experience His love, and invite Him into their lives, not as a distant figure, but as a living, breathing companion. The truth I had discovered was so simple, yet so powerful. And as more people embraced it, I knew that I was no longer alone in my mission. This wasn't just my message. It was the message for all people. As I continued preaching this new way of faith, I found myself more deeply connected to those who were listening. It was no longer just about speaking words. It was about living the message. It was about showing, through my actions, that this relationship with Christ was real, transformative, and available to everyone. My own life had been radically changed by the love of Jesus, and now I had the privilege of seeing that same transformation take place in others. There were stories, so many stories, of lives that had been turned around. People who had struggled with addiction, anxiety, and depression came to know a peace they had never known before. Families who had been torn apart by conflict found healing in the love of God. Individuals who had been wandering, feeling disconnected from everything that mattered, discovered the joy of living in communion with Christ. And it was in these moments that I felt the fulfillment of my mission. I had been called to share this truth, to help others experience the same love that had changed my life. And now I was seeing that calling come to fruition. One of the most remarkable things about this journey was the way it began to transcend denominational boundaries. Initially, I had focused on sharing my message within the Catholic Church. But as I traveled, speaking to different congregations and communities, I began to realize that the need for this message of relationship and love was universal. It wasn't just about the Catholic faith. It was about Christianity as a whole. It was about people of all walks of life, from every denomination, coming to know the love of Christ in a personal, authentic way. I began to speak in churches of all sizes, from small local gatherings to large megachurches, from those who followed traditional liturgies to those who embraced contemporary forms of worship. And everywhere I went, the message was the same. Faith is not about following rituals, reciting prayers, or living up to some standard of perfection. Faith is about opening your heart to God, allowing Him to transform you from the inside out. It's about being in relationship with Jesus, walking with Him through the highs and lows of life, and receiving His love and grace without reservation. With each new place I visited, I saw more people who were hungry for this truth. They had been disillusioned by religion, burned out by the demands of ritual, and searching for something more. I could relate to them, for I had once been in their shoes. I had spent years following the rituals, believing that if I performed well enough, I could earn God's favor. But now I knew the truth. There was nothing we could do to earn God's love. It was already given to us freely, without condition, and we only had to open our hearts to receive it. And so I continued my mission with unwavering dedication. I wrote books, recorded videos, and spoke at conferences, all aimed at helping people understand the profound simplicity of a relationship with Christ. I shared my story, my experience, and the lessons I had learned along the way. I was no longer just a priest delivering sermons. I was a messenger of God's love, spreading the truth that could change lives, heal broken hearts, and restore families. But as I continued to share this message, I realized that the work was far from finished. There were still countless people who had never heard of this personal relationship with Jesus. There were still many who were trapped in the cycle of religion, going through the motions, reciting prayers, and checking off boxes without ever truly experiencing the love of Christ. And that, I knew, was my mission: to help them understand that faith is not about doing, it's about being. There was a sense of urgency in my heart. I had seen the darkness in the world, the disillusionment, the brokenness, the pain. And I knew that the answer was not in more religious activities, more rules, or more rituals. The answer was in a personal, intimate relationship with Jesus Christ. It was in knowing Him, walking with Him, and experiencing His love in a way that transformed every part of your life. I began to see that this message was not just for individuals. It was for families, for communities, and for entire nations. As more people embraced the truth of God's love, I saw entire communities begin to change. People began to live differently. They loved more deeply, served more selflessly, and forgave more freely. The love of Christ began to heal the wounds that had been caused by years of religious legalism and judgment. And as I looked around at the transformation taking place, I knew that this was only the beginning. I had spent so many years caught up in the structures of religion, thinking that the right words, the right actions, and the right rituals would lead me closer to God. But now I knew the truth. It was not about those things. It was about opening my heart to God's love, allowing His grace to pour into every area of my life, and sharing that love with the world. In the end, I realized that the mission I had been given was not about preaching a new doctrine or a new set of rules. It was about inviting people into a relationship with a living, breathing Savior. And as I continued to walk this path, I knew that no matter what obstacles lay ahead, I would never turn back. I had found the truth, and it was worth every sacrifice. Jesus was real. His love was real. And that was the message that I would carry with me for the rest of my life.